Black Pine Archives. Tonight, the desert did not feel empty. It felt managed. These were 9 documented Arizona small-town case files, compiled from emergency call fragments, receipts, dash recordings, field notes, and statements that never sat comfortably inside a normal explanation. Heat does strange things to people. Distance does stranger things. And in places where the road runs straight for miles under a hard white sun, the line between lost and taken can get thin without anyone noticing. If you value grounded horror told like an archive and not like a campfire, subscribe to Black Pine Archives and keep the notification bell on. These 9 accounts share a pattern that does not belong to coincidence. After the last file, leave a comment with the one detail you cannot shake. Now, begin. They were not looking for a mystery. They were looking for shade. Mason Ketter and Alina Rowe had been driving through central Arizona in late July, trying to stitch together a cheap weekend loop between small towns, empty overlooks, and whatever air-conditioned stops they could find. Their car's air conditioning worked the way it always worked in desert heat. It made noise. It pushed lukewarm air, and it lost the argument by early afternoon. The dashboard display showed the outside temperature in a number that looked less like information and more like a warning. They pulled off the highway because the heat had become a physical pressure. The road ahead shimmered as if it were melting. The horizon looked close and unreachable at the same time. They saw a town sign, small and sun-bleached, and took the exit because the map promised a diner and the diner promised refrigeration. The town looked like it had been built to endure light and then abandoned by it. One main road, a diner with a flat roof, a courthouse set back behind a gravel lot, a few storefronts with drawn blinds, no trees tall enough to matter. A water tower rose behind the low roofs, the only structure that reached above the buildings as if it had been designed to be seen from miles away. Alina noticed the shadow first because she was the one who always noticed shapes and angles. The water tower's shadow cut across the road in a hard, diagonal line, dark enough to look like painted asphalt. She watched it while Mason parked, expecting it to slide, stretch, drift the way every shadow drifted as the sun moved. It did not move. It held its exact position as if pinned to the road. Its edges stayed crisp. Its angle remained identical. Even the thin lattice pattern of the tower's legs stayed fixed, like a stencil pressed down on the world. Mason took the keys out and stood there for a moment with his hand still on the door, staring at that line of darkness. Heat made people see things wrong. That was the first explanation that came to him. Heat, mirages, eye strain, a trick of glare. Then he looked away and looked back again. Nothing had changed. Inside the car, the clock said one thing. Alina's phone said another. Mason's watch said something close enough to be comforting. They were all within a few minutes of each other, and normally that would have meant nothing. In that town, it mattered immediately. The diner's door opened with a heavy pull, and cold air hit their faces like a relief that felt almost emotional. A wall clock ticked over the counter with stubborn clarity, each click distinct. Mason watched the second hand for 2 full rotations and realized he could not tell whether it was moving too fast or whether his own sense of time had started to slip. The diner was not crowded, but it was not empty. People sat alone or in pairs, eating slowly, moving as if conserving energy. A waitress set down sweating glasses without asking questions, her eyes never moving toward the front windows that faced the water tower. Alina noticed something else. The chairs closest to the window were turned slightly away, as if someone had adjusted them with a shared preference in mind. Not fear, exactly, more like habit, like avoiding a draft. On the diner's front door, taped at eye level, was a printed notice. It was fresh paper, clean corners, heavy black ink. Someone had taken time to center the text. Someone had wanted it legible. No one looks at the old water tower after midday. There was no official seal, no signature, no explanation. Just that one rule stated like it had been proven. Alina photographed it on instinct. The photo later showed the paper clearly, except the last word blurred in a way that made no sense for a steady hand and a clean lens. Mason tried to treat it as local superstition, a prank, a small-town warning meant to keep tourists from trespassing. But the way the diners behaved around it did not match a joke. They did not laugh. They did not roll their eyes. They did not even look curious. They looked managed. Outside, the heat hit again, thicker than before. The water tower stood against a flat sky. Its paint looked older up close, sun-faded and chalky, with rust stains running down the legs like dried blood. The access ladder was missing from the bottom section, as if someone had removed it to prevent climbing. Under it, the shadow line still cut across the road, in the exact same place. Alina watched the shadow and then looked down at her own feet. Her shadow did not match the position it should have at that hour. It fell the wrong way by a small but undeniable angle, as if her body belonged to one sun and the town belonged to another. She recorded a voice memo with her phone held close to her mouth, breathing shallow. It felt like the light was nailed in place. The clock in my hand said one thing, and the world outside said another. From Alina's voice, Memo Mason tried to leave before the feeling could become a story. They got in the car and drove toward the edge of town where the main road rejoined the highway. The pavement looked normal, painted lines, sun glare, heat shimmer, but their mileage barely changed. The same cluster of mailboxes appeared again. The same cracked billboard for a long closed attraction drifted past on the right. Mason told himself he had made a wrong turn. Then he saw the courthouse again, the same flag barely moving, the same gravel lot. He drove a second loop, then a third. Each time, the town's edge behaved like a suggestion instead of a boundary. Roads that should have carried them outward curved gently back in. Intersections that should have offered choices offered only returns. The navigation app tried to reroute, then stalled, then displayed the same instruction again with a new, estimated arrival time that contradicted itself. Alina's phone battery dropped in sudden, uneven steps, as if something had demanded power without permission. Mason wrote a quick note in his phone, one line meant to anchor him to the obvious truth. The car moved, but the town did not change. The sun stayed fixed. From Mason's phone note, they parked again by the diner because it was the only place that felt stable. More vehicles were now in the lot than before, as if other travelers had arrived and chosen the same refuge. People stood in small clusters on the sidewalk, careful not to look up too long, careful not to face the tower directly. A man near the payphone box rubbed his eyes with the heel of his hand, like he was trying to reset his vision. A teenager sat in the shade of the building and stared at his own shadow with the intensity of someone measuring it for proof. Alina checked her time again. The wall clock inside the diner now differed from her phone by a wider gap. It was still only minutes, but it was the kind of gap that grew the longer she watched. A municipal employee's incident log later recorded the day with a restraint that suggested the writer had been trained not to speculate. The shadows held steady past noon. Multiple civilian reports confirmed no drift. From a town maintenance log, Mason finally noticed the way the locals timed their behavior. People looked at their watches, then looked away. Cars moved only in short bursts. Doors opened, then closed again. It was like the town was waiting for a signal. A local deputy arrived in an unmarked vehicle and stepped into the diner as if he had done it many times for the same reason. He didn't ask why Mason and Alina looked shaken. He didn't ask what they had seen. He asked one question that landed like a test: whether they had looked at the water tower after midday. Mason shook his head too quickly. Alina hesitated. The deputy's report later summarized their response without emotion. Visitors presented with disorientation consistent with prior incidents. Both denied direct observation of tower. One exhibited delay before denial. From a deputy field report, the deputy directed them to wait in the diner parking lot until the siren sounded. He did not explain what siren, no one asked him to. The town already behaved as if the siren was inevitable. From the lot, the water tower was visible over the rooftops. Alina forced herself to keep her gaze on the diner notice she had photographed, on the words, like a railing. Mason watched the sky instead, waiting for the moment the sunlight would finally shift and prove this had all been a nervous misunderstanding. Time dragged and did not drag. The sensation was wrong in both directions. Minutes felt thick, seconds felt thin. Alina's phone updated once, then refused to update again. Then the sound came. 3 chimes, spaced evenly, rolling over the town with a tone that felt older than any modern warning system. Not a tornado siren, not a police siren, a measured signal, like a bell struck in a precise pattern to mark a boundary. When the 3rd chime ended, the air changed. Not cooler, not calmer. Different in the way a room felt after pressure was released from a sealed container. The sunlight shifted. It was subtle, but it was real. The water tower's shadow line slid a fraction of an inch across the asphalt, breaking the spell of its fixed edge. People in the lot exhaled in small, invisible ways. Some returned to their cars. Some went back inside. The town resumed movement as if permitted again. Alina noticed something else in that moment. Her shadow corrected itself. The angle matched where it should have been. Mason started the car immediately. He did not wait to see whether the shift would continue. He drove out of town with the careful speed of someone afraid that haste might trigger another rule. This time, the road carried them forward. The billboard did not repeat. The mailboxes did not return. The highway appeared like a relief that felt almost humiliating because it meant the world still worked the way it was supposed to. They did not stop until they reached a larger town with chain stores and bright signage and a sky that moved without permission. Hours later, Alina tried to upload the photo of the diner notice. The image failed repeatedly. When it finally sent, the text looked altered. The last line read differently, as if the printer ink had been overwritten. No one looks at the old water tower after midnight. Alina listened to her voice memo again and found a brief, blank gap in the audio, exactly 1 minute long, placed in the middle like a missing tile. They never returned to that town. They never found its notice online. They never located its water tower on satellite maps in a way that made the geography make sense. But Mason developed a habit he could not explain to anyone without sounding irrational. Any time a water tower appeared on the horizon during a road trip, he kept his eyes low and drove straight through, refusing to look too long, as if the act of noticing could invite the light to stop again. Archival transition. The first file ended with a rule about where not to look. The next began with a receipt that told someone where to go. Raphael Dyer made his living moving freight that never deserved a passenger seat. Small contracts, fast deadlines, long roads. He knew the desert the way other people knew their own kitchens. Which exits had light, which pumps accepted cards after midnight, which stores kept their restrooms unlocked, and which stretches of asphalt could swallow a signal so completely that even emergency calls felt like a gamble. On the night of August 9th, he ran east of Phoenix with a half-full tank and an empty stomach, chasing the familiar comfort of a lit sign in a sea of dark. The station he chose sat far enough from the highway that the engine noise faded into a dull hum. Its canopy lights were harsh and white, steady in a way that felt too deliberate, the kind of light that made shadows look cut out and artificial. He fueled up, went inside for water, and paid without making conversation because there was no conversation to make. The register area was clean, but the counter looked untouched, like a display. The air smelled faintly of hot dust, sanitizer, and that burnt sugar scent of overheated plastic. A bell above the door did not ring when he entered or when he left. Raphael took the receipt out of habit and folded it once, intending to toss it later. It was the kind of thin paper that curled instantly in heat. It existed to record proof of ordinary life. He unfolded it again in his truck because something about the transaction felt incomplete. There was no total, no gallons, no tax line. In the space where a price should have been, a coordinate string sat in perfect printer font, letters and numbers arranged like a location pin. Beneath it was a second line that looked less like accounting and more like instruction, a short sequence broken by a comma as if it expected a map to finish the thought. He checked the header: correct station name, correct date, correct time, and then, instead of an amount, a destination. A later note added to the case file by a state trooper summarized the anomaly with the dry language of someone trying to keep their own thoughts from showing. Receipt printed location data in place of amount. Coordinates appeared in standard GPS format. From a state trooper note, Raphael sat with the engine idling and the receipt in his hand, letting the air conditioner fight the heat for a few more minutes. He tried to imagine a normal reason: a software error, a hacked system, a prank configured into the register by someone bored enough to enjoy the confusion. The coordinates looked real. That was the problem, not random symbols, not nonsense. They had the clean rhythm of a place you could drive to. Curiosity was not something Raphael considered a weakness. It was a survival tool. It was the reason he knew which roads were safe, which stops were trouble, which detours were worth the time. It was also the reason he made decisions that looked foolish in hindsight. He typed the coordinates into his navigation app. The app accepted them instantly. A route appeared without hesitation. The location was close enough to feel harmless. Less than an hour, a back road, a dirt track, a point in open desert that did not have a name. Raphael placed the receipt on the passenger seat, like a document he might need to prove later. He pulled out of the station, turned back towards the highway, and then took the exit the route demanded. The paved road narrowed. Streetlights vanished. The desert widened around him with the quiet confidence of empty land. His phone signal thinned to 1 bar, then dropped to none, in the way it always did out there. The navigation arrow kept moving anyway, as if the map did not rely on towers to know where it was guiding him. The last stretch was gravel, then dirt, then a track that looked like it existed only because tires had insisted it did. The coordinates led him to a flat clearing surrounded by low scrub and scattered rock. His headlights swept over something pale and circular. At first, he thought it was trash. Then his beams settled and he realized it was stone. A ring of stones arranged in an almost perfect circle, not decorative, not natural. Each rock had been placed by a hand that cared about spacing. The circle looked new in the way freshly built things look new, even when made of old material. The stones were clean on top, darker underneath, as if they had been turned recently. In the center of the circle sat a car, a compact sedan with no one inside. Its paint looked dull under the headlights, and its windows reflected nothing but Raphael's own beams. The driver's door stood slightly ajar, not wide open, just enough to suggest someone had left in a hurry or had been interrupted mid-exit. Raphael parked outside the circle because stepping into boundaries you do not understand is an instinct you either have or learn too late. He shut off his engine and immediately felt the desert swallow sound. The silence became sharp, not peaceful, accusatory. He walked forward with the receipt in one hand and his phone in the other. The car's hood radiated heat, not residual warmth from a vehicle that had been parked hours ago. Real heat that rose in shimmering waves, the kind that came off metal after a hard drive. Raphael touched the hood with his fingertips and jerked his hand back. The engine had been running recently, minutes, not hours. There were no footprints around it. The ground was soft enough to show marks. Fine dust, scattered pebbles, a thin crust that should have held a shoe print clearly. Raphael could see his own boot impressions as soon as he stepped forward, crisp and undeniable. Around the sedan, there were none. No tracks leading away, no scuffs by the open door, no disturbed dust where someone had stood and shifted their weight. The only disruption was the stone ring itself. Several rocks showed fresh drag lines in the dust, as if the circle had been adjusted, tightened, recentered, made perfect. Raphael raised his phone and filmed because the desert had a way of making memory feel unreliable, and he needed proof of his own senses. There was a circle of stones like a boundary. The engine heat was still coming off the hood. From Raphael's phone video narration, inside the car, the interior smelled like warm plastic and faint human sweat. The seats were slightly damp, as if someone had been sitting there with a body heat that had not yet dissipated. A water bottle sat in the cup holder without a label. The keys were missing. The dash display was dark. The gear selector was in park. Raphael did not sit. He did not reach deeper than his arms. He noticed a detail that made his throat tighten. On the inside edge of the open door, where the paint met the weather stripping, there was a smear of dark dust shaped like a partial handprint, not fully pressed, more like someone had touched the door while pulling away and left only the edge of their palm. Raphael stepped back and looked at the stone ring again. From outside it, the circle looked like an object. From inside it, it felt like a decision. He returned to his truck and tried to call emergency services. No service. He tried to send a location pin to a friend. The message failed. He turned his radio on and found only static, except for a brief, faint pulse that sounded like a tone beginning and then cutting out, as if a station had started to transmit and then reconsidered. He drove back toward the gas station with the receipt still on the passenger seat, unwilling to leave it behind, unwilling to keep it either. The route the app had given him vanished halfway back, as if the map had decided it had done its job and no longer needed to pretend. When the station's canopy lights came into view again, Raphael felt a wave of relief that surprised him. He pulled in and immediately saw the first real sign of human presence. A different car at a pump, a figure moving inside the store. He went back to the counter and asked to see the clerk, not to accuse, but to anchor what had happened in a shared reality. The clerk looked confused by Raphael's tone, the way frightened people try to sound casual. Raphael placed the receipt on the counter. The clerk stared at it and then at Raphael, and then back at the paper. The coordinates were still there, but the ink looked wrong in the center, faint and bruised, as if something had been pressed hard against the paper until the toner bled away. In the area where a price would have been, the paper had been smeared by heat, not burned, but softened, like it had been held too close to something hot. Raphael checked his fingers. They were clean. The smear had not come from him. The station manager pulled footage from the security system later that night. The video showed Raphael at the pump. It showed the receipt printing. It showed him stepping back and glancing down at the paper. It showed him leaving the frame. Then the image stuttered. The feed froze for a moment, jumped forward and resumed with Raphael already pulling away from the station. The missing span was short enough to be dismissed and long enough to feel deliberate. The station incident report contained the only sentence the manager could stand behind. Video dropped for approximately 1 minute, no explanation found. From a station incident report, Raphael filed a report with State Patrol because he needed a paper trail. The abandoned sedan was recovered the next day, towed from a location that the tow driver later described as empty desert, no landmarks. The tow sheet listed the vehicle as found with no occupants, dock or unsecured, engine cold by the time of recovery. The registration returned a name that did not match any active missing person report in the county database. It matched a name that appeared months later in a local cemetery ledger, recorded under a category that made no sense for a living person. Not a death date, not a birth date, a disappearance date. Raphael did not go back to the coordinates. He did not keep the receipt. He burned it in a metal tray behind his house because paper that behaved like a compass did not feel safe in a desk drawer. But he kept the video. He watched it in the following weeks and noticed a detail that had not registered at the time. In the moment his camera panned across the stone circle, the audio captured a faint sound underneath the desert wind. A soft scrape, pause, soft scrape, like a rock being dragged a few inches to correct a shape. Archival transition. The receipt pointed toward a circle in the desert. The next file began with a key waiting in a lobby where no one was there to hand it over. Dylan Shore took contract work the way some people took seasonal weather. It arrived, it passed, it paid. He moved from site to site with a duffel bag, a laptop, and the practiced habit of sleeping wherever the road allowed. He cared less about comfort than he did about predictability, and on the night of November 7th, predictability was the only thing he wanted. He had been driving through northern Arizona for hours, long enough that the dark stopped feeling like night and started feeling like a substance. His headlights carved a narrow tunnel through it. The air outside his windows was cold, but the road still held the day's heat in a faint shimmer that never fully disappeared. When he saw the motel sign, he felt relief before he felt doubt. The property sat back from the highway behind a gravel lot and a row of low, dim rooms. The sign promised vacancies. The lot was nearly empty. The building looked like it survived on truckers, late shifts, and people who did not ask questions. The lobby light was on. The glass door was unlocked. The entrance smelled faintly of stale coffee and disinfectant. There was no receptionist, no radio playing, no television murmuring behind a wall, no footsteps, no shadow moving behind the office window. The front desk had a bell, but Dylan did not press it. Something about the silence made him feel like the sound would not behave properly if he introduced it. An envelope sat on the counter beneath a buzzing fluorescent bulb. It was clean white paper, uncreased, with his full name written across the front in careful block letters, not his first name only, not a nickname. The full name he used for tax forms and contracts. The letters were steady, not rushed, as if someone had copied them from a file. Dylan stopped with his hands at his sides, staring at the envelope until his brain produced the usual rational options. A coincidence, the wrong guest, a prank, a clerical mistake. Then he checked the only thing that could anchor it. He pulled out his phone. No confirmation email, no reservation number, no message, no missed calls. He opened his bank app. No pending charge, no payment, nothing. The envelope was still there. Waiting, he opened it. Inside was a plastic key card and a slip of paper with a room number written in the same block letters. The key card looked new. The magnetic stripe was unscuffed. The motel logo was printed cleanly, as if it had come straight from a box. Dylan kept the envelope because he could not stand the idea of leaving it behind. He would later describe that decision as automatic, like picking up your own mail. The envelope had my name, spelled correctly. I did not book anything. From Dylan's written statement, he hesitated at the threshold, looking out through the lobby glass at the empty lot. The highway was a dark line beyond the property, and the nearest set of taillights was already fading. Continuing to drive felt worse than staying somewhere that felt wrong in a quiet, careful way. He took the key card, picked up his bag, and followed the corridor toward the assigned room. The hallway felt cooler than it should have. not the normal chill of an air conditioner, more like the building held cold the way stone held it, storing it without explanation. The carpet smelled faintly of bleach and old dust. Every few steps, the overhead lights hummed with a steady note, never flickering, never easing. When he reached the door, the key worked on the first swipe. The room opened without resistance. Inside, the bed was made with tight corners, too crisp to suggest casual cleaning. The television was unplugged. The curtains were drawn perfectly closed, leaving no gap for the parking lot's light to spill in. A single paper cup sat on the dresser like a marker placed on purpose, and the bathroom towels were stacked with their edges aligned as if someone had squared them with a ruler. Dylan did a slow walk of the room with the kind of cautious diligence that came from living out of motels for years. No one in the closet, no open window, no hidden door, no smell of cigarettes, nothing that explained why the air felt a degree too still. He locked the deadbolt and the chain. He set his phone on the nightstand. He placed the envelope and the keycard beside it, aligned without thinking, the way people line things up when they want control. He lay down fully clothed and stared at the ceiling until fatigue began to blur the edges of his fear. Sometime after midnight, he heard movement outside. Not voices, not conversation, not laughter or argument, just the careful sound of someone testing doors. It began far down the corridor, faint enough that he almost dismissed it as plumbing. Then it repeated with a pattern that made it unmistakable. A handle turned gently, a pause, a soft click, another pause, then a few steps, then the same again. The sequence moved at a measured pace, as if whoever was doing it had nowhere else to be and no need to hurry. Dylan sat up slowly, keeping his breathing quiet. He listened and began to count the rhythm, because counting was what his mind did when it needed an anchor. The clicks approached room by room, a steady progression that turned the hallway into a timeline. When the sound reached the neighboring door, it lingered longer than the others. The handle turned once, then again, slightly harder, then stopped. The footsteps resumed. Closer, Dylan watched his phone screen light up without him touching it. The display showed a time that did not match the clock on the nightstand. Both times looked plausible. Both were close. The difference between them was exactly 1 minute, the kind of small misalignment people ignored until it repeated often enough to become a signature. He reached under the blanket and opened the voice recorder with the brightness turned down. His hands were steady, but his fingertips felt numb. The sound continued, methodical and patient, until it reached his door. The handle turned softly. A pause. Another turn, careful, as if testing whether the deadbolt was engaged. Then nothing for a moment that felt too long. Not silence exactly, more like the hallway had leaned in. Dylan's phone recorded the hush, and underneath it, a tiny sound like plastic shifting near the card reader, as if someone had brushed something against the lock without fully swiping. He did not move. He did not cough. He did not reach for a weapon. He stayed still the way prey stayed still when it realized movement was what drew attention. The handle turned one last time, and then the footsteps continued past his door, down toward the end of the corridor, never speeding up, never breaking the pattern. Dylan waited until he could no longer hear it. He waited longer than that. He did not sleep again. He recorded a short note before dawn, speaking barely above a whisper, the kind of whisper that did not carry through walls. Someone checked every handle. When it reached my door, it waited. From Dylan's audio note in the morning, he left early. The lobby was empty again. The counter was wiped clean. No envelopes sat beneath the buzzing light. The bell remained untouched. There was no sign-in sheet, no key rack, no staff member appearing from a back room with an apology for being away. Outside, the gravel lot looked exactly the same as it had in the night. Even the tire tracks seemed undisturbed, as if no one else had arrived or left. Dylan loaded his bag into his car and set the key card on the dashboard. intending to drop it somewhere public later, like evidence he did not want to carry but did not want to hide. As he pulled onto the highway, he glanced at the card again. The printed room number had smeared overnight, as if rubbed by a damp hand. The edges of the ink looked dragged, softened, not scratched away but blurred. The plastic itself felt slightly tacky when he touched it, like it had been warmed and cooled too quickly. Then he noticed something else. On the back of the card, beneath the motel logo and the standard emergency exit instructions, a second line of text had appeared in faint gray. It was not printed like the rest. It looked like it had been pressed into the surface by heat or pressure. Letters shallow but legible. Do not look up after noon. Dylan pulled onto the shoulder and stared at the message until the words stopped feeling like language and started feeling like a rule. He did not return to the motel to ask questions. He did not report it to local police because he had no address that felt real enough to report. He drove north until the sun rose high and the sky looked normal again. And even then he kept catching himself glancing down as if the road itself might have its own posted warnings if he looked hard enough. Later, when he reviewed his audio clip, he heard the corridor clicks clearly. He also heard something he had not noticed at the time, a brief, soft tone under the last pause at his door, like a locked channel opening and closing in less than a second, a sound that resembled a system confirming access. Archival transition. One file left a warning in plain language. The next file delivered a warning in sound carried by a siren that should not have existed anymore. Megan Avery and Jules Caro were the kind of tourists who planned loosely and trusted the road to fill in the blanks. They had driven across central Arizona in late summer with a cooler of drinks, a tent that packed down too small to be durable, and the quiet confidence of people who believed the desert was empty in a harmless way. By the time they reached the outskirts of a small town, the day had pressed itself into their skin. Heat sat in their clothes. Heat clung to the steering wheel. Even after sunset, the air felt like it belonged to afternoon. They did not book a motel. They did not want fluorescent lights and a room that smelled like bleach. They wanted the kind of sleep you got in open land, where the night air finally moved and the stars looked close enough to touch. They found a spot outside town near a dry wash where the ground dipped and the wind occasionally slid through cooler, carrying the faint mineral smell of stone. Their campsite sat low, sheltered by scrub and a shallow rise. They pitched the tent, ate quickly, and watched distant porch lights blink out one by one until the land looked unoccupied. The desert did what it always did at night. It got quieter than expected. It made each small sound feel important. Sometime after midnight, Jules woke first, not because of noise, but because the air changed. The wind stopped moving. The silence tightened. Megan woke a moment later, already aware of an approaching sound in the way a body sensed thunder before it heard it. At 2:12 in the morning, the siren sounded. It did not roll in from far away. It arrived already full. The tone rose and fell in a pattern designed to command attention, designed to erase hesitation and replace it with instinct. It was loud enough to vibrate through the ground. It made their tent fabric tremble. It pushed into their ribs like pressure. Megan later described it as directional, not a general warning, but a sound with a clear source, as if the siren stood just over the low ridge to the north, close enough that it should have been visible. They did what people did now when something did not fit. They reached for proof. Megan grabbed her phone with shaking hands and filmed through the tent mesh, the camera catching only darkness and a thin strip of starlight. The audio captured the siren cleanly, without distortion, without distance, the kind of recording you got when the source was near and unobstructed. The siren was clean and close, like it was right over the ridge. From Megan's video description, Jules checked the weather on his phone. There was no alert, no warning, no advisory. The signal was weak, but strong enough to load a forecast that showed nothing dangerous, nothing unusual, nothing that could explain a tornado warning siren in a state where tornado sirens were not part of daily life. He opened a map app, half expecting to see a pinned location labeled Emergency Station. The screen loaded slowly, then froze, then refreshed to show a blank stretch, as if the wash and the ridge had been cut out of the world. The siren continued for a full cycle, then stopped. The silence afterward was worse. It felt staged, as if the land waited to see what they would do with their fear. Megan and Jules did not run. There was nowhere to run in a dark desert wash. They sat upright in the tent and listened for the next thing. They listened for wind. They listened for voices. They listened for the distant engine sound of emergency vehicles that should have followed a warning siren. Nothing came. They stayed awake until the first pale hint of morning lifted the sky. When the sun finally rose, it did so normally, climbing in a way that made the siren feel like a mistake they could dismiss. They packed quickly and drove into town to find coffee and someone who could tell them what they had heard. The town looked ordinary in daylight. The streets were wide. The buildings were low. The air smelled like dust and sun-warmed asphalt. A diner sign buzzed weakly. A small grocery store had a handwritten board out front advertising ice. They asked the first person they saw, a man unlocking a door, whether the siren had been a test. He reacted too quickly. The shrug came fast, practiced, like a reflex learned over years of answering the same question with the same non-answer. His face held an empty smile that did not reach his eyes. He looked past them rather than at them, as if eye contact might count as participation. They asked again inside the diner, careful, casual, trying to sound like people who were only curious. A waitress poured coffee and did not respond at first. Then she gave them a sentence that landed flat and unhelpful, the kind of sentence meant to end a conversation. She did not glance toward the window. She did not ask where they had camped. She did not ask if they were safe. She moved away as if the question had contaminated the air. Jules stepped outside and saw something behind a chain-link fence at the edge of a municipal lot. A siren pole. It stood with the dull fatigue of old equipment. The horn assembly looked weathered. The base was surrounded by weeds and sun-bleached gravel. A small sign hung on the fence warning against trespassing, but the warning looked older than the paint. A man in a work shirt stood nearby smoking, watching Jules watch the pole. His gaze was hard, not angry, but weary. When Jules gestured toward the siren pole and then toward the sky, the man made a small cutting motion across his throat, quick and final, then turned away. Megan and Jules found a public notice board outside the town offices. Among the posted flyers was a photocopied municipal summary from a past maintenance cycle, stapled at the corner, listing infrastructure updates in dry language. Legacy warning siren decommissioned and disconnected. No power source. From municipal records summary, the words should have resolved it. Decommissioned, disconnected, no power source. But the siren had been too clean, too near, too physical. Back at their car, Megan replayed the recording. In daylight, the sound felt even stranger. The siren tone was strong and stable, without the warble of a failing motor. Under the wail, threaded faintly but consistently, was something else, a metallic tapping nested beneath the siren in a strict pattern. 3 taps, a pause, 3 taps. It was subtle. It was easy to miss if you were not listening for it. But once Megan heard it, she could not unhear it. It wasn't just a siren, there were taps underneath it, like someone was signaling through the sound. From Megan's follow-up note added to the file, Jules checked the video metadata on his phone. The file's timestamp claimed the recording began at 2:11 in the morning. They both remembered waking at 2:12. They both remembered saying the time out loud because it felt oddly specific. 1 minute was not a big difference. not in normal life. Here it felt like a signature. They left town before noon. They drove without stopping until the landscape changed, and the feeling of being observed loosened its grip. They told themselves they would laugh about it later, the way people laughed about weird things that happened on vacation. They did not laugh. Weeks later, when they showed the video to a friend who worked in emergency management, he focused on one detail they had not noticed. The siren tone was correct, but the rise and fall timing did not match modern warning systems. It matched older mechanical patterns, the kind of pattern you would expect from equipment that had been taken offline years ago. Megan and Jules tried to find official documentation that explained a test, a malfunction, a backup generator, anything. The town records stayed minimal. The residents stayed closed. The internet offered nothing reliable. What remained was the recording and a pattern that appeared again and again in other files. The 1-minute shift, the 3 taps beneath a larger signal, a warning delivered through a system that was supposed to be dead. Archival transition, the siren pulled attention toward the sky. The next file pulled attention toward the ground, where footprints appeared without a body to make them. Kara Minette had moved to Arizona for work less than a year earlier, and she still carried that newcomer's habit of documenting anything that felt local, not for an audience, not for a channel, just the small proof that she had been somewhere real under a different kind of sky. On an evening in early autumn, she drove through a small town on her way back from a site visit and noticed a park tucked between low houses and an old school building. The sun was dropping, painting everything in long, warm angles, and the light made the playground equipment look staged, like a photo meant to sell a quiet life. She parked with the engine still hot, stepped out, and immediately felt how still the air was. No breeze, no rustle in trees, no movement in the weeds along the curb. Even the birds were quiet in the way they got quiet when heat had not fully let go. The playground was empty. The slide stood untouched. The jungle gym cast a sharp shadow across sand that looked freshly raked by some earlier storm. Then Kara saw the swings. 2 swings hung from a metal frame, their chains old enough to have darkened at the links. They moved in a steady rhythm, forward and back, without any change in speed. Not a random drifting motion, not a gust and then stillness. A consistent arc, as if a hand kept pushing them at the same distance every time. Kara lifted her phone and filmed without thinking. The sound picked up the faint chain creak, regular as breathing. She panned up to the trees to prove there was no wind. The leaves did not move. She walked closer and felt something change inside her, the subtle shift that came when the brain realized a familiar rule had been broken. She filmed the sand beneath the swings. At first, the sand was smooth except for old scuffs. Then a new impression appeared, crisp at the edges, toe marks and a small heel pressed down as if a foot had landed with a child's weight. Kara froze, expecting to see a kid sprint out laughing, expecting to see a prank, expecting anything that fit. A second footprint appeared beside the first. Then a third. They formed a line leading away from the swing set, each impression arriving one after another, timed with the swing's forward motion as if the swing itself was counting steps. The swings kept time with no wind. Then footprints showed up like someone was walking. From Kara's phone footage description, Kara did not speak. She did not call out. She stayed behind the invisible path and followed it with the camera. The footprints crossed the sand, stepped onto a patch of dry dirt where the ground was hard enough that impressions should not have formed. And yet the dust there still showed faint marks, like pressure without weight. The line continued toward the edge of the park where the old school building sat. The school looked shut down. Boards covered the lower windows. The paint had peeled around the frames in long strips. A chain link fence ran along one side, and behind it, The building dropped into a basement-level entrance that looked more like a service hatch than a door meant for people. Kara had the sense, irrational but immediate, that the playground was not the center of this. It was the invitation. The footprints descended the short concrete steps toward the basement door. The door was metal, painted once and then left to weather. A heavy chain looped through the handle and around a pipe. A padlock hung at the center, dull and thick. A warning notice was posted above it, sun-faded but still readable, stating that the basement was unsafe due to structural damage. Kara stayed at the bottom of the steps, but did not cross the last few feet. She kept the camera raised and watched the footprints stop. They ended at the edge of the door's threshold, as if the invisible walker had stepped into the shadow and then paused. Kara held her breath, waiting for the next print to appear on the other side of the locked door, waiting for evidence that this was a trick of dust and light. Nothing appeared beyond the threshold. Instead, the dust on the door itself shifted. A palm-shaped impression formed slowly on the metal, not painted on, not smeared by a glove, but pressed into dust as if a hand had rested there and then lifted away. The print was small, child-sized in proportion, but the pressure looked wrong. The center of the palm was too defined. The edges were too clean. Kara's phone audio caught a faint sound then, soft and metallic, like a chain link settling. She backed away without turning her back fully, climbing the steps in reverse and keeping the camera on the door, until she reached the park again. As she moved, she noticed something else she had missed on the first pass. The swing rhythm had not stopped. It had not slowed. It maintained the same arc, as if the motion was not caused by wind, but by a rule that did not require air. Kara returned to her car and sat with the doors locked, watching the playground from behind glass. The shadows lengthened. The town stayed quiet. No one came to the park. No one walked a dog. No one crossed the street and asked what she was doing. It felt like the town had agreed to let that place belong to itself. Kara drove away before full dark. She took the long way out of town, staying on main streets, keeping her headlights away from the school building. Later that night, she replayed the footage in her apartment. The swings moved in the same steady rhythm. The footprints appeared in the same place. The handprint formed on the basement door in the same slow, deliberate way. But the part that tightened her throat was the timing. The swing arcs clustered in a pattern she had not noticed in real time. 3 forward motions with the same reach, a pause where the swings reached the apex and seemed to hang a fraction longer than physics allowed. Then 3 forward motions again. Kara wrote a short note in her phone to keep herself from changing the memory into something softer. It did not feel playful. It felt like a signal trying to get answered. From Kara's personal note attached to the file, she reported the footage to the school district office the next morning, expecting at least a security check. The response was polite and empty. Someone told her the park had issues with teens at night. Someone told her wind did strange things between buildings. Someone told her not to worry. A few days later, a maintenance worker inspected the basement entrance. The official report mentioned disturbed dust and dismissed it as animal activity. The language careful and dry. Fine particulate displaced at basement door. 1 palm-shaped impression observed. From maintenance report, the report did not mention the footprints leading to the door. It did not mention the swing pattern. It did not mention how the chain looked slightly different in Kara's footage, as if it had been handled recently. Kara never returned to the park. She stopped filming local things. She stopped taking detours through small towns. She began checking wind forecasts out of habit, not because she cared about weather, but because she wanted the reassurance that motion still belonged to air. The footage stayed on her phone, unchanged, a small piece of proof that a playground could function like a doorway, not opening, not closing, just indicating where something wanted to go. Archival transition. The park suggested a door that should stay closed. The next file suggested a road that should never have been opened. Henry Voss and Lila Serrano were not chasing folklore. They were chasing a recommendation. A diner a co-worker had described as worth the detour. The kind of place with cold pie and a sign that promised homemade coffee without irony. They had been driving west across Arizona for most of the day, the air outside their car turning heavy and bright, the landscape flattening into long distances that made every turn feel like a decision. By late afternoon, roadwork forced their navigation to reroute. The screen recalculated with the confidence of software that did not doubt itself. The new route was only a few minutes shorter, but it cut through a residential grid they did not recognize. The first strange thing was not the street itself, it was the map. A thin gray line appeared where there had been empty terrain moments earlier, branching from the main road and bending toward a canyon edge. It had no label, no street name, no neighborhood pin, but it looked clean on the display, integrated into the route as if it had always existed. The navigation voice did not hesitate. It simply instructed them to turn. Henry glanced up and saw the turnoff ahead. A fresh strip of asphalt cutting away from the sun-bleached road, too dark to have weathered even a season. The lane markings were crisp. The curb edges looked newly poured. He took the turn because that was what the screen told him to do, and because the physical world matched the instruction closely enough to feel legitimate. Lila leaned forward in her seat as the car rolled onto the new street. She expected to see a subdivision sign, a contractor banner, something that explained why a road looked like it had been laid down yesterday. There was nothing. No name at the entrance, no future home of placard, no utility work trucks. The street ran straight for a short distance, then curved gently toward the canyon. On both sides were houses, not houses in the way people built them over time, each one slightly different based on owner and budget and taste. These were identical units, repeated like copies. Same pale siding, same porch shape, same window arrangement, same blank rectangle above the door where a number plate should have been. No numbers, no mailboxes, no yard decorations, no tire marks in driveways. The lawns were too evenly cut, as if trimmed by a machine on a schedule. The gravel beds looked raked into the same pattern. The air smelled faintly of wet cement, a scent that did not fit the heat. Lila began filming short clips from the passenger window, trying to capture the sameness before her brain could soften it into something ordinary. The houses were identical and blank, like they were waiting to be assigned to someone. From Lila's camera note, Henry drove slowly, half expecting someone to step out and wave them off, half expecting to see a moving van, a contractor, a person. He saw none. Curtains hung behind windows, but the fabric did not stir. No televisions glowed, no dogs barked. The street itself sounded wrong under the tires, quiet in a way fresh asphalt could be, absorbing sound instead of echoing it. The navigation line on the phone continued forward, steady and certain, guiding them deeper. They reached the end in less than a minute, a dead end. No cul-de-sac, no turnaround sign, just the sudden termination of asphalt at an edge of packed dirt. Beyond it, the land dropped toward the canyon, the rock face visible in the distance like a cut in the earth. The sky above the canyon looked washed out, the sunlight flattening into a pale glare. At the edge of the road sat a mound of fresh soil. It was too dark, too moist, as if the earth had been turned recently and watered. It was shaped like a half-finished backfill, uneven, with shovel ridges still visible. The smell rose from it immediately, damp and metallic, the scent of ground that had not had time to dry. Henry stopped the car and kept it in drive, foot on the brake, the way people did when they did not want to commit to being somewhere. Lila lowered her phone and stared at the mound. Near the mound were wooden stakes pushed into the ground, thin and new, with orange ribbon tied at the top. The ribbons did not flutter. The air here was still, held tight, like it was trapped against the canyon wall. The stakes were arranged in a line. 3 ribbons clustered close, a short gap, 3 more ribbons. The pattern felt deliberate, not a random spacing choice, and Lila's attention snagged on it the same way it had snagged on the swing rhythm in the last file. Henry tried to take a breath and felt the inside of his chest tighten, a faint pressure that made the air feel thinner than it should have been at that elevation. Lila aimed her phone at the mound and zoomed in. There were marks in the soil, not footprints, not tire tracks. Something broader, a shallow depression that looked like a shoulder had pressed into damp earth and then lifted away. The shape was incomplete, as if whatever made it had shifted before leaving a full imprint. Henry did not get out of the car. He did not need to. His instincts were already rehearsing a retreat. He began to turn the vehicle around at the dead end, using the narrow space between curb and dirt to make a slow 3-point turn. As he did, the navigation line on the phone flickered once, then vanished. The screen did not show a reroute. It did not show a warning. The street itself disappeared from the map. Where the thin gray line had been, there was only blank terrain, a pale expanse with no features. The map looked like it had been peeled back to an earlier layer, like the software had decided the road did not exist and erased it to maintain consistency. Lila stared at the screen and then out the windshield, trying to reconcile the clean asphalt under them with the blankness on the device. It erased itself while we were still on it. The road was real under the tires, but the map pretended it wasn't there. From Lila's voice note recorded in the car, Henry finished the turn, and as he drove back, he kept checking the rearview mirror. The mound stayed visible longer than it should have in a residential street, as if the end of the road held the light differently and refused to fade. The identical houses passed again, repeating in reverse. Their blank number spaces caught the sunlight like empty eye sockets. When they reached what should have been the entrance, Henry slowed, searching for the turn that had led them in. There was no turn. The main road ran straight, bordered by desert scrub and a drainage ditch. No fresh asphalt branch, no curb cut, no sign of recent paving. No tire marks in the dirt shoulder that suggested cars had been turning there all day. Henry drove past and then turned around at the next intersection, returning to the same spot, scanning both sides. Still nothing. Lila checked the map again and again. The screen showed only the main road and empty terrain. The unlabeled street did not appear even as a faint gray suggestion. It was not hidden, it was absent. They circled the block twice, then 3 times, widening the loop, searching for any angle that might reveal the entrance from a different direction. The entrance did not return. Lila's hands began to shake in a way she tried to hide by holding her phone tighter. She saved the clips she had filmed and backed them up immediately, treating them like evidence that might evaporate if she waited. Henry drove on toward the diner without speaking much, the kind of silence that formed when 2 people shared the same conclusion but did not want to name it. Later, a county GIS technician would open a ticket based on an automated error report and write a cautious summary that made the anomaly sound like a harmless glitch. User submitted route showed an unregistered roadway. Field verification did not locate entry point. From GIS ticket summary, the ticket was marked resolved. The footage remained. That night, Henry dreamed of a water tower rising over a town that looked built for heat. He dreamed of a printed rule taped to a door. He woke with the sensation that the day had been held in place by something that did not want shadows to move. At noon the next day, Lila checked her phone and found a photo she did not remember taking. It was a close-up of the mound of earth at the dead end. In the center of the frame was the shallow impression, clearer than she had seen it in person, as if the camera had captured detail her eyes had missed. A broad curve, a ridge, the suggestion of a collarbone line, a human shape pressed into damp soil, not buried, not covered, just tested against the ground like a measurement. The photo's timestamp did not match their drive. It claimed it was taken 1 minute earlier than the moment her video clip began, even though the image looked like it belonged to the end of the road, not the approach. The difference was small. The pattern was not. Archival transition. A road that did not exist created a place that felt newly built. The next file described a place built for the dead, where the names had been removed on purpose. Tobias Reed had not planned to stop in that town. He had been driving a long stretch of highway that ran like a straight thought through heat shimmer, and his car's cooling system had begun to sound strained in a way that made him picture steam and roadside waiting. When he saw a small sign for fuel and shade, he took the exit on impulse, hoping for nothing more than a few minutes out of the sun. The town felt minimal, as if someone had built only what was necessary and refused to add anything decorative. A single grocery store with a sun-faded awning, a bar with a darkened window, a row of low houses pressed back from the road. The air was hot enough to blur edges, but the quiet was what Tobias noticed first. A quiet that did not feel peaceful so much as regulated. He bought water, filled the tank, and still felt like he needed somewhere cooler to let his engine and his body settle. That was how he ended up at the cemetery. It sat behind a chain-link fence a short drive from the main road, backed by dry ground and scattered trees that provided thin, unreliable shade. The gate was not locked. No sign warned him away. Nothing indicated the place was private or restricted. The moment he stepped inside, the temperature changed only slightly, but the light changed more. Shadows cut sharper here, dark and defined under the sparse branches. Tobias walked between the first rows, expecting the usual language of mourning. Names carved into stone, ages, family groupings, phrases people used when they ran out of anything else to say. He found none of it. Every headstone was blank except for a date. No names, no epitaphs, no symbols, no beloved, no rest. Just dates etched into stone with clean, careful lettering. Some stones carried only a day, a month, and a year. Others added a time written in words, as if timing mattered more than identity. Tobias paused at one marker and read it twice, trying to decide whether he was looking at a burial date or something else. The date did not look like death. It looked like a report, a line item, a reference point, the kind of thing a clerk recorded and filed. Tobias moved down the row slowly, squinting in the light. He recognized one date, not from personal memory, but from the modern habit of seeing tragedy in passing and then continuing with life. A missing tourist case he had read about late at night, months earlier. A headline about a couple who drove into the desert and never came back. The search described in careful language and then quietly discontinued. The stone held the same day, month, and year. His stomach tightened. He checked the next row, scanning stones until another date caught him. Familiar for the same reason. Another missing person story, another clipped article, another search that ended with no body and no explanation. He did not want to believe it, but the pattern pulled him forward. He took out his phone and began checking, not with a plan, just with growing unease. He searched old headlines, scanned cached copies, read snippets that matched what he had seen. The dates on the stones matched the dates in the reports. Not death dates, disappearance dates. Tobias stopped in front of a marker with a time written beneath the date, the words precise, as if the moment mattered down to the minute. The air around him seemed to hold still. Even the faint wind he had felt near the fence vanished among the rows. He turned his head and looked across the cemetery, and for the first time he noticed something else. There were no flowers, no vases, no decorations, no coins, no tokens. Nothing left behind to prove anyone had ever stood here grieving. The place did not feel like a cemetery built for the living to visit. It felt like a ledger. He kept walking until he reached the newest section at the far end, where the stones looked less weathered, the carving sharper. The ground here was more open, the shade thinner, the heat pressing down harder, and that was where Tobias found the date that shifted his fear into something colder, a marker with a date set for tomorrow. The day was written in the same format as the others, as certain as an appointment. Tobias stared at it, trying to force a rational explanation into place. A mistake, a prank, a misread. But the carving was deep and clean, not something scratched by a bored teenager. Beside that stone, the ground had been prepared. A rectangular patch of dirt had been cleared and smoothed, as if a worker had dragged a flat board over it. The soil was darker than the surrounding dust, and Tobias could see shallow rake lines across its surface. At the head of the rectangle stood a small stake. An orange ribbon was tied around it. 3 loops neatly formed, a short gap of bare string. 3 loops again. The pattern was too consistent to ignore. Tobias took a step back, heart beating in the shallow, fast way it beat when the body encountered something that did not belong in the world's rules. He raised his phone and took photos quickly, hands not steady. He did not frame them artistically. He just wanted proof. This is not a graveyard, it is a schedule. From Tobias's handwritten note, he left the cemetery with the sense that he was being watched without seeing eyes. The chain-link fence did not rattle. The gate did not creak. The whole place remained still behind him, as if his presence had not disturbed it at all. Back in town, Tobias drove to a small cafe because it was the only public place with air conditioning, and he needed to be near people. The room was dim and cool, the smell of coffee and fryer oil thick enough to feel grounding. He tried to ask casually whether anyone had relatives buried in the cemetery. The reactions were immediate in a way that told him he had touched a rule. A woman behind the counter looked away as if focusing on a spot that required her attention. A man at a table lifted his cup and drank without shifting his gaze. Someone near the door stood up and left without finishing their food. No one answered, not directly, not even with a denial. The silence was deliberate, the kind of silence towns learned when speaking created consequences. Tobias paid and left, driving until the town vanished in his mirrors, and the highway swallowed him again. Days later, when he reviewed the photos on a larger screen, he noticed details he had missed in the heat and urgency. Fine lines in the soil that suggested something had been dragged across it before he arrived, smoothing it, a faint series of scuffs near the prepared rectangle that did not look like shoe prints, and at the bottom edge of one image, half cut off by the frame, there was a shadow. It was shaped like latticework, angular and repeating, like the skeletal geometry of a water tower. The cemetery had no water tower nearby. The horizon in the photo was low. Nothing tall enough to cast that shape existed within view. The angle of the shadow did not match the sun. A later state investigators' field memo, written after a brief safety review of several small towns along that corridor, mentioned the location in cautious terms that tried to keep it mundane. Residents declined to confirm burial records. Multiple blank markers observed. From a field memo, the memo concluded there was no actionable concern. Tobias did not feel reassured. He kept one photo saved separately, the one with the date for tomorrow and the prepared ground beside it. He checked it too often, as if staring at the schedule might prevent it from being carried out. On the morning that matched the carved date, Tobias woke with a notification from a missing persons alert system he had never subscribed to. A person had vanished from a highway stretch outside a small Arizona town. The date on the alert matched the stone, and the time listed in the report, written out in official language, aligned with the cemetery's carved minute as if someone had been following a plan. Archival transition: a cemetery recorded disappearances like appointments. The next file carried the same control through a different channel, a dead radio frequency that spoke like a dispatcher. Sienna Park and her brother Raul had learned to drive Arizona at night the way locals did, not because it was romantic, but because it was practical. Daylight in late summer made the steering wheel too hot to touch without a sleeve. Night made the desert feel less like an oven and more like a long, quiet corridor. They left a small town after dinner, aiming for another one a few hours away, keeping the car stocked with water and the fuel tank above half out of habit. Raul handled navigation on his phone. Sienna handled the road, steady and conservative, watching for deer and blown tire debris and the rare truck that drifted too far into the shoulder. The radio stayed on low, mostly static and distant music, until the receiver clicked and locked onto a frequency with a clean, stable signal. The silence that followed was brief. Then a voice came through. It was calm, professional, even-toned in the way dispatchers and air traffic controllers sounded when they were trained to keep panic from spreading. It did not sound like a person chatting into a handheld. It sounded like a system. The voice identified them without hesitation. It described their vehicle by make and color. It described their direction of travel. It described the stretch of highway they were on as if reading from a screen that tracked them in real time. Sienna felt her hands tighten on the wheel before her mind fully caught up. Raul leaned forward, staring at the radio display as if the numbers could explain the impossibility. He recognized the frequency. He recognized it because he had once worked a temporary maintenance job for a county facility where radio channels were listed on laminated sheets and older frequencies were marked as retired. The channel their car had just found was supposed to be dead, decommissioned, empty. Still, the voice continued with the same measured pace, as if it had always been there. The instruction arrived without emotion. Do not turn. Raul opened the Notes app on his phone with the automatic urgency of someone trying to preserve a record before it slipped away, and typed with his thumbs while the voice spoke over the speakers. The voice named our car color and told us not to turn. The channel was supposed to be dead. From Raul's phone note, Sienna did not trust her own first reaction, so she did what people did when they needed to reassure themselves that something was wrong, but not impossible. She tested it. The next intersection appeared as a simple crossroad with a small reflective sign and a dirt lane branching off toward darkness. Raul expected her to stay straight because fear made obedience feel like safety, even when it was irrational. Sienna turned anyway. The effect was immediate enough to make her breath catch. Ahead of them, in the new lane, a car sat in the roadway with no headlights. It was not parked on the shoulder. It was not pulled partially into a driveway. It was positioned cleanly in the lane as if placed there to occupy the exact space their vehicle needed. Its silhouette absorbed light. Its windows reflected almost nothing. Sienna braked hard enough to shift the loose items in the back seat. The tires hissed on dusty pavement. For a moment she expected the other car's lights to snap on, the driver to react, to do anything that made it feel like a normal hazard. Nothing happened. Raul shined his phone flashlight through the windshield, and the beam did not seem to find a license plate. It hit metal, then slid off into shadow. Sienna reversed slowly, backing into the intersection again, hands shaking despite her effort to keep them steady. When she returned to the original route facing forward on the main road, she looked into the rearview mirror. The unlit car was gone. No taillights retreating, no engine sound fading, no motion at all. It simply was not there anymore. The radio voice resumed as if it had never paused, calm and matter-of-fact, holding the same tone that suggested authority was normal and questions were not. Sienna drove for several minutes in silence, and then the desert gave them another intersection, another chance to prove it had been coincidence. Raúl's fear hardened into stubbornness. He asked Sienna to test it again, not as a conversation, but as a mutual agreement that disbelief required proof. At the next junction, she turned again. Once more, a vehicle without lights appeared ahead in the lane. This time it was closer, positioned just beyond the reach of their headlights, forcing Sienna to slow immediately. The shape felt identical, the same lack of reflective markers, the same unnatural absence of headlamp glow. The car did not move. It did not react. It occupied the road like a barrier. Sienna reversed again, jaw clenched, and returned to the main route. Again, the unlit car vanished the instant they corrected. They drove on, and the radio voice continued to speak with the same steady cadence, repeating the instruction with slight variations that felt like administrative updates rather than warnings. Raúl noticed that the voice never used names. It never asked questions. It never checked for confirmation. It behaved like a system issuing a route. After the third intersection, Sienna stopped testing. She kept the car on the highway the voice seemed to want, the road stretching forward under the fixed stars. She tried to convince herself they were experiencing a bizarre local prank, a hacked transmitter, a rebroadcast from a nearby dispatch center. But that explanation began to break when she listened more closely. Under the dispatcher voice, faint but consistent, there was another sound, metallic tapping, not random clicking, not signal interference, not the shudder of speaker wiring. A pattern, 3 taps, a pause, 3 taps. The rhythm repeated beneath the voice like a second language, carried on the same channel. Raúl recorded a short clip on his phone, holding it near the dashboard speaker, hands unsteady. The recording later captured the voice clearly, but the tapping sat underneath it like a spine, too regular to dismiss. A highway patrol summary compiled after several similar reports across multiple nights included a line that echoed the siblings' experience, written in the dry tone of someone trying to keep the strange inside professional boundaries. Complainants described a vehicle operating without headlamps, no unit located on patrol sweep. From a patrol summary, Sienna's skin prickled with the sense that the radio was not merely broadcasting at them, it was watching their choices. When she finally pulled onto the shoulder to stop the experiment entirely, Raúl reached toward the radio and turned it off. The cabin fell silent, and then, in the silence, the tapping continued. It did not come through the speakers anymore. It came from inside the dashboard. 3 taps, a pause, 3 taps. Raúl froze, eyes wide, the phone still recording. Sienna stared at the dark radio display as if it might light up on its own. The tapping completed one more cycle, perfectly timed, and then stopped. The silence afterward felt staged, as if something had finished a signal and was waiting for the next response. Raúl checked the radio settings with trembling fingers. The frequency display showed nothing, only a blank screen as if the unit had reset. His phone, however, had kept the recording. When they started driving again, they did not turn onto any side roads, even the well-marked ones. They stayed on the most direct route, moving between small pools of cell service and long dead zones, both of them watching the horizon for an unlit car that might appear without warning. They reached the next town close to dawn. They stopped at a convenience store and sat in the parking lot under harsh lights, the kind that made every shadow feel like an accusation. Raúl checked his recorded clip again. Sienna kept her eyes on the road. In the playback, the dispatcher voice remained calm and clear, but the tapping sounded louder than either of them remembered. And at the very end of the file, after Raúl had turned the radio off, the recording captured a final detail that made his stomach drop. A soft click like a channel opening, and then the same calm voice, no longer filtered by radio static, speaking as if it were inside the car. "Do not turn. From Raoul's audio recording archival transition. The voice on the radio controlled the road. The final file left the same warning in dust on the outside of a house that should have been empty. Anya Calder and her partner Brent had stopped in the town for the same reason most people stopped in places like that. They were passing through. The gas gauge had dipped lower than they liked, and the heat made even a short detour feel like a decision with consequences. The town sat off a state route that cut through long stretches of sun-flattened land. Its entrance sign was sun-bleached and slightly tilted, as if someone had tried to straighten it years ago and then given up. The main road had a diner, a hardware store with dusty windows, and a courthouse lawn where grass tried to grow in stubborn patches. Their plan was simple: fuel, water, a short walk to loosen stiff legs, then back on the road before afternoon turned punishing. They parked near an older residential neighborhood where the streets still had names, even though many of the houses looked as if they belonged to a decade that had quietly ended. Some homes were maintained, others were shuttered, windows covered, yards overgrown with brittle weeds. It felt less like a ghost town and more like a place that had thinned out over time. Anya noticed the house because it was unmistakably boarded up and yet clearly lit. It stood at the end of a block where the sidewalk cracked into dry soil. Plywood sheets covered the front windows in careful rectangles nailed down with a consistency that suggested official work, not vandalism. The front door was shut, the frame intact. The porch steps were still solid. The abandonment was tidy, and still, light leaked from inside. Not warm lamp glow, not television flicker. A clean white brightness bled through a narrow seam between two planks, as if the interior held a fluorescent source pointed directly at the window. The light was steady, flat and clinical, the kind that made a room feel like it was being examined rather than lived in. Brent slowed beside her without needing to be told. His attention locked the way it did when something quiet became wrong. They stepped onto the porch. Dust lay thick on the boards, undisturbed. The layer looked old enough to hold weeks of stillness, a soft coat that would show any disturbance immediately. There were no footprints, no drag marks, no hints that anyone had been up there recently. Even the spider webs in the corner of the porch rail remained intact. Anya leaned forward and peered into the narrow seam where the light leaked, trying to see more without touching anything. The boards were flush enough that the view was only a slice of brightness. Her body reacted before her mind decided to. The hair on her arms lifted. The air on the porch felt warmer than the street, as if heat lingered around the entryway. Brent checked his phone for a signal out of habit. The bars were weak and unstable, blinking between 1 and none as if the device could not decide whether it belonged to the network. Anya found a thin crack near the edge of the window covering where a curtain had been pinned behind the boards. The fabric was visible through the seam, a pale edge pressed close to the plywood. She raised her hand, hesitated, then hooked 2 fingers gently into the gap and lifted the curtain the smallest amount possible, careful not to shift the boards or leave an obvious mark. The interior came into view in a narrow vertical strip. The room was lit without visible lamps. The brightness had no direction. It filled the space evenly, as if the air itself were glowing. The furniture inside did not look abandoned. It looked staged. A chair sat centered in the middle of the room, squared to the window as if positioned for someone to sit facing outward. A small table stood beside it, cleared completely except for a glass of water filled to a precise line, the kind of measured pour seen in hotels or clinical waiting rooms. No dust coated the tabletop. No clutter suggested daily life. The floor looked clean. Anya lowered the curtain slowly, heart beating too hard for the quiet moment. She stepped back from the window, breath shallow, and Brent watched her face tighten with the recognition that something about that light did not belong to any normal explanation. Anya wrote it down later, the way she wrote down anything that felt like it might become unbelievable the longer she carried it. We saw a white light inside a boarded house. It was steady, like a room waiting. From Anya's written statement, they decided to leave immediately, moving off the porch with the careful speed of people trying not to make the wrong kind of noise. As Anya stepped down from the top stair, she glanced back at the porch boards without meaning to. That was when she saw the handprint. It was fresh, pressed into the dust behind them. The print was too defined to be old. A full palm, 5 distinct fingers. The pressure marks looked deep enough that whoever had made it had pushed down hard, as if emphasizing a warning. The dust around it remained smooth and untouched, a clean negative space that did not match the random smudges of wind or insects. Anya froze. Brent stepped back up a single stair and stared at the spot where the print sat like a message. There were no other footprints in the dust, no approach marks, no heel scuffs, nothing that explained how the imprint had appeared in the brief span between Anya lifting the curtain and them turning to leave. Brent tried to swallow and found his throat dry. He lifted his phone to film the porch, hands shaking enough that the image drifted slightly. Anya's mind ran through explanations that did not hold. A prank, a hidden occupant, a neighbor watching from behind a fence. None of those explanations accounted for the dust remaining unbroken. They backed away from the porch without stepping anywhere near the print, moving as if the hand-shaped void might spread if they treated it casually. A deputy later responded to their call, and even his official phrasing carried the controlled discomfort of someone describing a fact that refused to be logical. One hand-shaped impression observed in dust layer. No corresponding tracks located. From a deputy photo log, the deputy photographed the porch boards, the seam where light leaked, and the handprint itself. He tested the front door for entry. It was locked. He checked the perimeter, shining a flashlight along the foundation and the backyard fence line. No one came out. No movement stirred inside. The light, however, remained steady. While the deputy worked, Anya stood at the curb and looked down the street to distract herself from the porch. The neighborhood seemed too quiet for midday. No dogs barked. No television sound leaked from open windows. Even the wind felt cautious, moving in small, careful pulses. A sound rose faintly in the distance. A siren tone, clean and rising, then falling again. The same controlled wail that demanded attention without offering context. It was not loud enough to locate precisely, but it was close enough to make Anya's skin tighten. Brent checked his phone again. The time display did not match Anya's. The difference was exactly 1 minute. Neither of them said anything about it. While the deputy was present, they did not need to. The pattern had already begun to show itself in their bodies, in the way their eyes avoided certain landmarks without knowing why. As they walked back to their car, Anya's gaze drifted to the end of the street where a water tower's metal frame rose above low rooftops. The structure was distant but visible, and she remembered with sudden clarity the warning that had appeared in Dylan Shore's case on the back of a motel keycard, written in the kind of faint ink that felt more like residue than print. Do not look up after noon. Anya kept her eyes low and forced herself to watch only the pavement and the car door handle and Brent's hand as he reached for the keys. Inside the vehicle, the air felt too warm despite the shade. Brent started the engine. The radio turned on by itself. For a fraction of a second, a clean channel opened with the quiet click of a system ready to speak. Then it fell back into static before either of them could process what they had heard. Anya did not look toward the house again. They drove out of town without stopping, and when the road finally stretched into empty desert again, the landscape felt normal in the way normalcy did after you had stepped too close to something managed and deliberate. Later, when Anya reviewed Brent's video of the porch, she noticed one detail she had not seen in the moment. The handprint did not look like it had been placed from above, the way a human hand would press down. It looked as if the dust had been pushed outward from beneath, as if something on the other side of the boards had pressed through the air and left its shape in the only material available. And beneath the audio of their breathing, faintly, there was a sound that did not belong to wind or traffic. 3 taps, a pause, 3 taps. Final archive note 9 files. 9 separate witnesses who did not know each other. And yet the pattern behaved like a system repeating its procedure. Time held in place, coordinates replacing prices, keys assigned to names, sirens that should have been dead, footprints without bodies, roads drawn and erased, graves scheduled without names, a dispatcher voice on a dead frequency, and a warning pressed into dust by a hand no one saw. If the same details snagged in your mind across multiple stories, that was not coincidence. That was how patterns announce themselves. If this episode stayed with you, comment the one rule you would not break after hearing these files. And if you wanted more documented case-style horror from places most people only drove through, subscribe to Black Pine Archives and keep the bell on.